All right, this is really exciting. I always have a really good time talking about drugs in public, so I'm excited to do this. And the reason, one of the reasons I'm excited is because this morning, in fact, I took a low dose of a psychoactive substance. It's non-toxic, it's non-addictive, and it shows potential for neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. This morning I took a low dose of LSD, a microdose of LSD. So how many of you have heard about microdosing before this talk today? Okay, most of you. Awesome. Now, how many of you have tried microdosing yourself? Quite a few of you as well. Great. So kind of what I want to get into before I start talking about what is microdosing and the phenomenon of microdosing is a little bit about my story and why I'm standing in front of you today talking about this really highly illegal substance. I grew up in a really Christian, conservative, traditional home in a place called West Michigan, where I was taught, similar to what Tabitha was saying, that drugs are bad. Specifically, the drugs that our government tells us are illegal are bad. And I smoked cannabis when I was 16, and then I tried LSD when I was 19, and I didn't really agree with that assessment. In fact, not only were they not bad, but I had some of the most profound experiences of my life while on a psychedelic substance. In fact, that experience for me was so transformative that I made a commitment and a decision to pursue a more unconventional path after graduating from university. So I moved eventually to Thailand, where I started my own business. I did the Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week ideal. It's not a 4-hour work week, A. But B, it's really easy to bootstrap in a place like Chiang Mai where I was living. And while I was there, I was struggling with a couple things, as all initial entrepreneurs struggle with. I was easily distracted by Facebook and by other things on social media. And I had a really hard time unlearning from my past these things that I'd been taught about following rules and following directions and kind of falling in line. I had a hard time unlearning those things from an academic setting and relearning what it really takes to be adaptable and to be a successful entrepreneur. So I was struggling with adaptability, and I was struggling with creativity and really focus. And then I started microdosing, and that changed a lot for me. Finally, I was able to eliminate the distractions and really focus on what was matter. And I was also able to, kind of just push away my past and some things that weren't so helpful and focus on what I really needed to learn now to be really successful and to be what I wanted to become. So what is microdosing, right? We'll get into that. Microdosing, hold on, I gotta pursue that here. Microdosing is the consumption of a low dose of a psychedelic. So your typical dose of LSD or mushrooms when you have a trip, it's about 1/10 of that. You don't really have any sort of trip. It's actually sub-perceptible. You might have a little bit of a glow, but that's about it. And when people microdose, they do it twice a week for an extended period of time. And what they notice is from day 0 to day 90, a significant change in their subjective experience. They have increased creativity. They're a little more focused on task, flow states, which I'll get into in a little bit. The relationships improve, and this comes back to presence and mindfulness. A lot of the benefits that people are experiencing with microdosing could also be compared to what you might get on a mindfulness meditation practice. And finally, some level of patience and ability to, not be as distracted. This is what we call impulse control. Now, it's my belief that microdosing will change the cultural perception of psychedelics. And that's particularly because of what I'm focusing on today, which is leadership development and creativity. So what we've been seeing with microdosing is a significant increase in interest in Silicon Valley and the tech world. Now, why is that? One, from a leadership development perspective, it comes back to adaptability, this ability to unlearn and relearn new things. I want you to think of someone who you perceive or who you understand to be an effective leader in your life. Think of that individual. What makes them an effective leader? Chances are, what makes them an effective leader is someone who can be completely present with the moment, who can let go of things from the past, who can not focus so far in the future that they get anxious, but instead can take all available data and can make a really informed, accurate decision moment by moment by moment. This is adaptability, and this is what microdosing helps to do. Now, this is becoming increasingly important in a world that is growing more and more chaotic and complex. There's all of this information that we're now subject to. And if we want to have effective leaders, if you want to be an effective leader, if I want to be an effective leader, I must be able to understand that information and synthesize it into something that makes a practical difference in the real world. And this is what microdosing can help to do. Chaos, complexity, microdosing helps with total presence and making the right decision in that moment. What we look for in leaders is that ability. The second thing is microdosing and flow states. So this ties into the creativity aspect. How many of you are familiar with the concept of flow? You've heard of it before. So flow is like being in the zone. It's like when time disappears and nothing gets in the way of what you're looking at or what you're working on or what you're engaged in. So take a project that you might be working on. It's a really complex, difficult project. Research shows that when we enter flow states, we can attack that project, we can solve the complexity of the problems that we're dealing with in a much more effective and efficient way. Now, research also shows that people who spend more time in flow and spend more time in these creative states are actually happier. And that also gets into another aspect of why microdosing is becoming so popular in the tech space and in Silicon Valley. There's an epidemic of depression going on because people feel so isolated. And microdosing, because of its effect on serotonin, the happy molecule, is having that antidepressant effect. And so when we're not as depressed, right, when we're not as focused on the past, fixated on the past, we can be more present in the moment. We can access these flow states much easier. And this is really important in a world where in 5 to 10 years, because of tech, because of what we're all talking about, what we're all working on, the need to do these rote tasks that industrialization really kind of forced us to fixate on, A, B, C, it won't be necessary anymore. It won't be valuable anymore. Instead, what will be valuable are people who can access these flow states so they can solve incredibly complex problems in an efficient and an effective way. I mean, if we just look at some of the problems that we're dealing with as a global society, climate change, social media is becoming an increasingly issue, the disparity between urban and rural areas. These are huge, huge problems that, if not addressed appropriately, could lead to massive chaos in the near future. And so we need leaders who are able to access flow states, who can handle these problems in a really effective and efficient way. And again, microdosing helps with the creativity and the flow states. So I just want to share a quote with you. This quote is from the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. It's a book written by Jim Fadiman, who was on the Tim Ferriss podcast about 2 years ago and spoke about microdosing. This is when it kicked off all the hoopla in Silicon Valley about microdosing. And that's actually not that quote, so I messed that up. This is the quote, yeah. Subdoses of 10 to 20 micrograms allow me to increase my focus, open my heart, and achieve breakthrough results while remaining integrated within my routine. I would venture to say that my wit, response time, and visual and mental acuity seem greater than normal on it. I utilize a subdose about 6 days each month, the protocol aspect of microdosing, and sometimes more often if I am engrossed in a project requiring extraordinary focus, flow states, creativity. This has been my practice for more than 10 years, and it has facilitated my success working in mainstream and independent media, staff-level positions in government, and publishing dozens of pieces of journalistic work. So this is Madeline, who's a professional from Manhattan. Now, these anecdotal reports, they're quite common. In fact, through my website, The Third Wave, we've collected dozens, if not hundreds, of similar reports from people in all sorts of professions and situations. Now, the third wave, I want to quick explain that because I kind of glossed over that. And I think that's an important understanding before I get into the next slide, which is this depatterning one. So the third wave is really the third wave of psychedelics. And maybe you've heard of, a third wave terminology before. Third wave coffee, third wave feminism. There have been a couple books released called The Third Wave. I didn't copy any of those, I promise. The first wave of psychedelics was the indigenous use for thousands of years across all global society. Psychedelics are actually quite normal for human beings. It's just really in the past 50 years that it's become quite unnormal to use them. The second wave of psychedelics was the attempted reintroduction of these substances in the 60s. This was the counterculture. And really, the introduction of psychedelics kicked off the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement. It helped people to understand that they were connected and that there was this sense of consciousness that enveloped all of us together. And so we made a lot of strides forward to really protect people's right to life and happiness and all these things that we know to be true in Western liberal democracies. Now, the third wave of psychedelics is the use of psychedelics for specific intentional outcomes. So we've seen some of this with research already. MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, can cure PTSD in 68% of trials. Psilocybin, the active ingredient in psilocybin mushrooms, can cure treatment-resistant depression. More and more research is coming out, but it's not only for these issues of depression and PTSD and addiction. We can also use psychedelics for the betterment of well people. And the reason microdosing is kicking off gets into this quote. Researchers have concluded that intoxication does indeed play a powerful evolutionary role called depatterning. In nature, animals often get stuck in ruts, repeating the same actions over and over with diminishing returns. It is my impression that drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior on the part of both humans and animals enjoys an intimate connection with depatterning. We all use drugs, caffeine, tobacco, alcohol. All of these are drugs. The way that we're approaching drugs is now changing because the systems in the world that we're living in are now changing. And that's why psychedelics, particularly microdosing, is really seeing a renaissance. But we're still, I have a minute and a half, so I want to get to the ending. We're still at a point where these substances are not legal, which is bullshit. Frankly, it's horseshit. The prohibition of psychedelics, I'm fucking this up. The prohibition of psychedelics is one of the greatest failures of scientific and political institutions over the last 50 years. We know these substances are effective at treating a myriad of mental health issues, and we have a government that still tells us that we can't fucking use them. So I encourage you to think of a question. What is required to improve the availability of psychedelic substances within a responsible, integrated, science-based framework? They're not legal yet, but we need to make them accessible. Not only for everyone in this room who's interested in leadership development and creativity, but also for the millions of people who are struggling with debilitating mental health issues that have little hope except for these substances. So this is the question that my team at the Third Wave is working to answer. And if any of you at all are interested in helping us to answer this question, I encourage you to reach out and look at ways that we can collaborate. Thank you.